So when I sat back to think about what we should talk about here on the final day of training camp, it is the final day of training camp. Like I've been saying all week, they wrap up today with practice in the south side. I'll be down there with lots of coverage as always. And then the kickoff luncheon tomorrow, and then it's into game week and prep for Pittsburgh Day against Duquesne. We won't talk about all the promotions going on because we don't want to run into any trademark issues with that. But as I was thinking about, like, what should we talk about on the Morning Pit, the day of the last training camp practice of 2025 with the season really right around the corner, I was like, oh, maybe we should do one of those like top 5 episodes. But I was like, well, what top 5 would we do? Top 5 most important players, top 5 biggest position battles, top 5 biggest question marks, top 5 biggest games of the season, right? Like, which one? How could we pick one? And then I decided, well, we won't just do one episode with those on one of those top 5 topics. We will do one episode with all of those top 5 topics. And so we're going to go as rapid fire as my verbose self is capable of. 5 most important players, 5 biggest position battles, as they were coming into training camp and how they've sort of resolved themselves. 5 biggest questions facing the team, and then 5 biggest games on the schedule. It's one of our 5 biggest episodes. Maybe, depending on how wordy I get with this, it could be one of our 5 longest episodes ever of the Morning Pit. But either way, let's dive into it. The Morning Pit, the 5 biggest episode, right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. What I really should have done is taken last night's over-unders and just talked about those today, because that's always a lot of fun. It was fun going over it with Jim, doing the over-unders on the live show. We did it last year and had a lot of fun with it. We did it again last night and had a lot of fun with it. We have those published on Panther-Lair.com if you want to see all the over-unders that I set for this team in 2025 and place your bets accordingly. Some of the numbers ended up being pretty good last year as far as kind of close to what ended up happening. Some were way off, but they got the bets sort of evenly split. Anyway, doesn't matter. The over-unders, that was a lot of fun. I could have made a whole Morning Pit episode out of that, but we're not going to do it. We're going to get these 5 biggest conversations, 5 most important players, 5 biggest position battles, 5 biggest questions, and 5 biggest games. And that's what we're going to talk about here on the Thursday edition of the Morning Pit. Don't forget, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com so you never miss any of our Pit video content. These daily Morning Pit videos every day of the week, Monday through Friday. Our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. like we did last night with me and you and Jim Hammett. We all get together and hang out and talk about Pitt sports. It's a lot of fun. We have post-game shows here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com that we'll do after every game. Home games will be a couple hours after the game ends. Road games will go live pretty much as soon as the final horn blows, as it were. And that's always some of our most enjoyable live shows. We always like doing those post game shows. But we also have press conferences, interviews, practice highlights, all kinds of videos right here for you at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe, and that way you won't miss any of it. And then, of course, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, the Pitt site on the 24/7 Sports Network, and that's where you can get all the Pitt coverage. Pitt football, Pitt basketball, Pitt recruiting, Pitt transfers, Pitt everything, all at Panther-Lair.com. All right, all these topics are 5 biggest something except for this first one, which is the most important players on the team. What could I call this? The 5 biggest. It's not the 5 biggest players on the team, but the 5 most important players on the team. And Jim called this right from the start of training camp. Somebody asked who's the player Pitt can least afford to lose. And I was kind of bouncing around this guy, that guy, but Jim is absolutely right. It's Desmond Reed. Desmond Reed is a player that Pitt can least afford to lose, partially because of the drop-off from him to the rest of the running backs, even though I think there are talented players there, and largely just because he makes their offense really good, really dangerous. When he's not out there, and I think this has affected Pitt's offense during some of their scrimmages, because Desmond Reed pretty much hasn't played at all in the scrimmages, because why would he? I think it has hurt their offense. I think it's made it easier to defend their offense when you don't have Desmond Reed out there to take handoffs and catch passes and just command so much attention from opposing defenses. Ignore him at your own will, or at your own peril, I should say. And I think teams figured that out last year, and I think they're going to figure it out again this year. Desmond Reed, I would say, is the most important player on this team, followed closely by Eli Holstein. For whatever we want to say about Eli Holstein, for whatever we want to write about Eli Holstein, for however we want to dig into his performance last year, or talk about what he's done in training camp or scrimmages or spring camp or anything like that, he still has shown the ability to be a very good quarterback and be a guy who can drive this offense down the field. He can put the team on his back. He has led them to comeback victories, multiple fourth quarter wins, multiple comeback wins. He's a gamer. I think he's got a chance to be a really good quarterback because at times last year he played like a really good quarterback. And here again, I think the fall off, the drop off from QB1 to QB2, QB3 is rather significant. I think. I think Eli Holstein is, at this point in everyone's respective careers, that far ahead that I don't know if the drop-off will be like it was last year. I think it's a different situation with Eli Holstein being a second-year guy, but the backups being, Cole Gonzalez, Mason Heinchel, as opposed to, Nate Yarnell, David Lynch, because Julian Duggar technically wasn't even a backup. He should have been. He should have been higher on the depth chart, but he wasn't. That's a whole other conversation. But the fall off, Eli Holstein's their best option. And so I think he's one of the most important players. I also would say the same about Lyndon Cooper. And Cooper, just like when we look at Eli Holstein and we look at how Pitt did or what happened to Pitt without Eli Holstein last year, I think you can look at what happened to Pitt without Lyndon Cooper last year. When he came out during that Clemson game, it derailed their offense to a certain extent. That goal line stand, they ended up like defending themselves at the goal line, even though they had the ball. With the procedure penalties and whatnot, some of that, if not all of that, or at least certainly a good portion of that, can be put on, just the disruption that was caused by changing centers due to Lyndon Cooper getting hurt. And so they may or may not have better depth behind him this year. They definitely would be better off not finding out this year. I think Lyndon Cooper is that far ahead of everyone else at center, and I think he's a good stabilizing force on this offense and a good leader of this offense. I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out he's one of the captains for this team in 2025. On defense, my fourth and fifth guys that are most important, it's Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles. There's a drop-off matter of, from what it's like when you go from them to the guys behind them. But I also just think these guys are absolute studs. Pro Football Focus rated them the two highest graded, I assume as a projection for the 2025 season, but the two highest rated linebackers in the ACC. I think these are two guys with all conference potential. These are two guys with all America potential. Kyle Lewis has already been an All-American. Rasheem Biles has stats that compare very favorably to Kyle Lewis, and he's got some pretty intriguing athletic ability and measurables in terms of his size and how he can run. I don't think you can afford to lose Kyle Lewis and or Rasheem Biles. It's not a Desmond Reed situation, but it's not that far off. And I wouldn't necessarily rank them, I went Reed, Holstein, Cooper, Lewis, Biles. I wouldn't necessarily rank them in that order. I think you can look at the depth at defensive line, the depth at cornerback, the depth at safety, and you don't want to lose your starters at any of those spots, but you've got some depth at all of them. And I'm not saying they don't have depth at linebacker, but you're talking about two of the best players on the team in Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles. I think there's two of the five most important players on the team this season. All right, top five position battles, at least as they were entering training camp and where they stand coming out of training camp. The biggest one was at left tackle, where they had Jeff Percy and Kendall Stanley coming in as transfers, battling for that open left tackle job. I think that one's coming down to Percy, the transfer from Michigan, who played in about 40-some games for the Wolverines, started 3. It just seems like he's the front runner there, with Kendall Stanley from the transfer from Charlotte backing him up. I don't think there was really much of a competition at left guard. Keith Cuvea kind of locked onto that one, even though he moved around some different positions, but he more or less locked into that one at the back in spring camp. But left tackle, I think that competition probably extended a little bit into training camp. But I think it's going to be Jeff Percy who starts out there. The wide receiver 3 position battle is an interesting one, and I'm calling it wide receiver 3 just because I think you knew that and felt confident that Kenny Johnson and Raphael Williams were going to be your two of your starting receivers, and I still think that's the case. I call it wide receiver 3 because you're looking at a third receiver to go with those guys, but it may actually end up being the guy who is positioned as wide receiver 2, who finishes as wide receiver 2 in terms of targets and production. But either way, looking for a third receiver to start with Johnson and Williams, and I think that question was answered by the Louisville transfer, Blue Hicks. I think he has come in. He's established himself as one of the top 3 receivers on the team. I think he'll get targeted as such. I think his final stats will reflect that. I think he'll be a starter, and I think he'll see the kind of playing time that you saw. Last year it was Kenny Johnson, Konate Munfield, and Raphael Williams. I think this year it'll be Johnson, Williams, and Blue Hicks. He'll be that. I don't want to say that third guy, but he'll fill out the trio, the starting trio, and I think he'll be a heavily targeted player in the passing game. I think there was a battle of defensive tackle. And I don't know if that one's entirely resolved. I think I said this earlier in the week about some of the questions they need to figure out. They need to get their defensive line settled. It's less consequential who starts at defensive tackle. It really is, because they will rotate those guys a lot. So if it's Sean Fitzsimmons and Francis Brew, if it's Sean Fitzsimmons and Isaiah Neal, if it's Brew and Neal, if it's Jasir Whittington, if it's Nick James, whatever the combination is, they're all, or at least the top 4 out of that group, are going to play quite a bit. In rotation, those guys will see a lot of snaps. If it's season started tomorrow, my guess might be Fitzsimmons and Brew. But because I think I wouldn't be surprised if we see 3 or 4 different guys getting starts over the course of the season, because the coaches will go by who practices the best in any given week, knowing that they're all going to play. So I think, Fitzsimmons and Brew might be the top 2 guys, but I'm not going to count out Isaiah Neal. I'm not going to count out Jasir Whittington. I'm not going to count out Nick James, who was a starter last season. I think he might have slipped out of the top 2 with how Fitzsimmons and Brew and Neal have practiced this camp, but he's going to be in that rotation as well. I think there's a battle at the starting cornerback job. I wouldn't be surprised if the 2 upperclassmen, the 2 seniors, Damon Lynam and Rashad Battle, win those starting jobs, hold on to those starting jobs. But Shadarian Harrison's coming on and has had a really good camp by all accounts, and there again, sort of like the defensive tackle position, he's going to play, and he's going to play a lot, and he's going to be in the rotation. I wouldn't be surprised if he starts some games. If you go back to last year, I don't think Donovan McMillan started every game. Some of these positions, like defensive line, actually, you could look at linebacker. Braylon Lovelace started a handful of games last year over Rasheem Biles. So you look throughout the defensive positions, and I think you see changing starting lineups based on how guys practice, but all the main guys all play a lot. And it might be, you're starting 11 plus 7, 8, 9 reserves, 10 reserves who come in, but a lot of guys get significant snaps. And I think that'll be the case at corner. I do think Shadarian Harrison will win the starting job in some weeks, and in some weeks he won't. And I don't know if he would go in ahead of Battle or Lynam or however that might shake out, but I do think you'll see all those guys out there. And so I think that was an interesting competition, and probably a pretty good competition in training camp. And then the last one, and this just kind of popped onto my radar yesterday, Pat Narduzzi said that today he'll make an announcement about the starting kicker. Now, I just assumed when you bring in a transfer kicker, they brought in James London from Murray State as a scholarship kicker. I just assumed you bring in a transfer scholarship kicker to be your starting kicker. But if there's an announcement to be made, maybe it'll still just end up being James London, and there's no drama whatsoever. Sort of wonder. Narduzzi brought up a couple of walk-ons, Trey Bukowski and Sam Carpenter. Who knows? I'm guessing it'll still be London, but we'll find out. So that was an interesting sort of position battle that emerged over the course of training camp. London has had some inconsistencies in the spring and seemingly carrying over into the summer, but will he get benched for a walk-on or replaced, or will a walk-on end up as the starter? It's an interesting question. All right, speaking of questions, some of the biggest questions facing this team this year, and the number one question is Eli Holstein. Well, I don't know if this is the number one question. It's a top question. One of the top 5 biggest questions facing the team this year. Can Holstein be the quarterback he was in the first 5 games last season? There was a lot that changed between his first 5 games and his second 5 games. His stats were certainly among it. His completion percentage dropped almost 10 percentage points. His yards per attempt dropped almost 4 yards. He threw 4 interceptions in his final 5 games and only 3 in his first 5. He threw 15 touchdowns in his first 5 games and only 2 in his second 5 games. There's a level of competition factor, that's relevant and should be considered. But at the same time, Holstein would be the first to tell you that he didn't play well in those final 5 games that he played. Cal, Syracuse, SMU, Virginia, and Boston or Louisville. And so he's got to get better. He's got to be closer to that player he was in the first 5 games. And I think he would tell you there's a lot of mental work he needs to do, film work, studying the offense, studying defenses. He said he's been getting work in, watching film with Pat Narduzzi to learn about defenses to help him. Holstein taking those steps forward is maybe the biggest question this year. Tied into that question is a question about the offensive line and the protection it can provide. They did not do well last season. They gave up like 40 sacks last year, and part of that was because they had guys get hurt, and that's going to tie into another question later, of course. But the offensive line has to protect better than they did a year ago, and that's going to be one of the biggest questions facing this team in 2025. Flip side, they need to be able to get pressure, particularly out of the defensive line, which they just didn't have enough of last season. They need pressure and sacks and tackles for loss from the defensive line. The linebackers will get theirs, and they should get theirs, and those guys are great. They put up big numbers last year. You need a little bit more of that balance going to the defensive line to allow the linebackers to get freed to make more plays. That's one of the biggest question marks. Can the defensive line get consistent pressure? Another question is just, can the stars be stars? There's always a question, particularly if you have a guy who has a breakout season. Can he do it again? I am 99.998% confident that Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles and Desmond Reed and anybody else who had a breakout season last year can do it again. Braylon Lovelace, I'm like I said, 99.998% confident that they can and that they will. But we need to actually see it happen. And a lot of this season is depending on those guys doing it. And as always, a lot of this season is depending on players staying healthy. We talked about the most important players on the team, but it's really across the board. You just can't have big rashes of injury. You've got to keep guys on the field. They've got pretty solid depth at a bunch of positions, but it's not good enough to weather the storm of mass injuries. And you know what? For the vast majority of college football, the rosters aren't deep enough to weather that storm. A big area where I think NIL and the transfer portal are creating separation in college football and maybe not leveling the playing field the way some thought they might is that some of the bigger teams are just buying up starters from other schools to be depth players. Solomon DeShields, right, goes to Texas A&M, not to be a starting linebacker, but to be a depth player. And that's what you're looking at. You're looking at those big schools, those schools with deep pockets, luring starters away to come in and be their reserves. And that's tough. Pitt's not in a position to do that. So Pitt can build a really strong starting 11 on each side of the ball and maybe even have decent depth at a handful of those positions. But they're not going to be deep enough to withstand more than a few injuries without some major step backs and drop-offs like we saw last year. And so the biggest question this year, and it's going to be the biggest question every year, can they stay healthy? All right, 5 biggest games on the schedule. We'll wrap up with this. Look, we're not even going all that much longer than we typically do. 5 biggest games on the schedule, all right? You may think it's this. You may think it's that. I'll tell you what it is. And I'll list them right off the bat, okay? West Virginia, Boston College, Syracuse, NC State, and Stanford. 5 biggest games on the schedule. You win those 5 games, and you've got a chance to have a good season. Because what are those 5 games? West Virginia we're including here because it's the it's the backyard brawl, but I also don't think West Virginia is going to be all that great this year. It kind of looks like they might struggle, and so West Virginia, Boston College, Syracuse, NC State, and Stanford, these are the landmine games. These are the pothole games. These are the stub your toe games, and we see them every year for Pitt, right? Like last year, Virginia and Boston College, despite Pitt's depleted roster, were winnable games that they should have won. And that's the difference between 7 wins and 9 wins. In 2023, they were bad, right? Pitt was bad. They lost, they went 3-9. Well, there was the Virginia Tech game, the Wake Forest game, the Syracuse game, the Duke game, and maybe even you could throw in the West Virginia game. That, like, those were landmine games, pothole games that make the difference between 3 wins and 7 wins. 2022, they lost to Georgia Tech and Louisville. Bad losses. You know, like pothole games, stub your toe type of games. 2021, the Western Michigan game. 2020, Boston College. But 2019, Boston College. It's always Boston College. Don't lose to Boston College. You know what I mean? And this year, there's a handful of Boston colleges. There's Syracuse. There's NC State. There's Stanford. We could almost maybe put Georgia Tech in there, but I think Georgia Tech's going to be pretty good this year. Don't lose to Boston College or the Boston College tier of football. Because if you win those 5 games, right, and you beat Duquesne and Central Michigan, you're now at 7 wins, which means every one of the games you win against Louisville, Florida State, Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, Miami is truly icing on the cake. One of those, you just win one of those games, you're at 8. If you can pull off 2, now you've won 9 games. That's going to be the difference. It's not going to be how many of those 5 upper tier games you can win. It's taking care of business against the Boston colleges. Okay? And so those are the 5 most important games on the schedule because you need to win those to create the foundation so that if you do beat Louisville or Notre Dame or Florida State or Georgia Tech or Miami, you are doing it to add to your win total, not just to get to bowl eligibility. Like, oh, they got to beat Georgia Tech and Miami if they want to get bowl eligible. No, you don't want to be in that situation. You want to be in a situation where you take care of business against the many Boston colleges in this world. There's you know, you want to be in a position where you take care of business against the many Boston colleges on this schedule so that if you beat one of those better teams or 2 of those better teams or 3 of those better teams, you're truly elevating your record, not just trying to play catch up. Does that make sense? And so, so I mean, you look at like 2023, right? If they don't blow it against, I mean, West Virginia was a game they should have won. Virginia Tech was a game they should have won. Boston College, Syracuse, those are 4 more games they should have won, right? So if you can take care of business in those games, then the Louisville game, that big upset win, and Duke too. All right, let's throw in Duke. You take care of business in those 5 games, then the Louisville game, the big upset win is getting you from 7 to 8 rather than 2 to 3. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what you want those bigger wins, the upset wins, the more toss-up games to represent is the games that get you from 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10. So the 5 most important games on the schedule are West Virginia, Boston College, Syracuse, NC State, and Stanford. And look at that. We're only a little over 20 minutes. Not bad. We got a lot done here today. This was one of the more productive morning pits that we've had in a long time. Listen, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I appreciate you tuning in. We got our mailbag tomorrow, and then it's game week, baby. It's coming up next week. So enjoy your final weekend without Pitt football, and then get ready to lock in for the season. Like and subscribe. Check out the website, Panther-Lair.com. I hope you've had a great week so far. Enjoy your Thursday, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.